So welcome to our first online conversation in 2018. It's non-church partnerships. We have with us today Stephen Spicer, as well as myself, Carla Leon. We're going to be kind of leading the conversation, but just a reminder that all of you are part of this conversation. So we do have kind of a little bit of open questions that we're going to be pausing with every once in a while, and also just letting us know kind of your story of what brought you here today and the importance of that. So I know many of you already through Embracing the Spirit, but I'd love to go through everyone on the line, and we'll start with Stephen. How did I drag you here today?
Good afternoon, morning, everybody. I don't know where you are geographically, so it could be any kind of time or weather zone. So Carla and I have been talking for the last, year, I guess, on a couple of innovative projects here in Wellington. So I'm in Wellington, Ontario, Southern Ontario, very much on the shores of Lake Ontario. It's actually out my window. It's what used to be a farming community that now has become a tourism community. And I'll get the secretary to answer my phone. Sorry about that. And then, so we've been looking at a number of issues around partnering with various local governments, looking at issues of housing and food security. And so it's just, I asked a bunch of crazy questions and Carla said, wow, you're crazy enough to be part of this conversation. So let's continue it. So hopefully today I'll help guide you through some ways of creating partnerships or ways of moving through them and things maybe you haven't thought about in this home in church.
Great, thank you. And now I'll invite everyone on the line. If you would like to introduce yourself, I'd love for you guys to jump in. Anne, Carolyn, Sandy, Sean.
Hi there, I'm Michelle and I'm in Toronto. And I'm here just out of curiosity. I have a church community here that I belong to, Leaside United Church. And we're going through some transitions. And partnership has come up, so I'm interested in this topic.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome. Peter, you're not shy, so I didn't even say your name.
Okay, my name is Peter. I co-authored a book with Carla on the Give Back economy, which includes applying partnerships to help grow the economy. We also have a model which includes community innovation hub within a church, a co-working space, a maker space, and an agri-hood, which applies using farming methods and agriculture in both rural and urban settings. That's enough.
Okay. Whew. Sean, did you want to introduce yourself? Oh,
sure.
You're there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm with a congregation called Visions United, which is in the Greater Moncton area of New Brunswick.
Wow.
And my work with them is of a transitional nature. And we've been working since I've come 2 years ago on, they're now 6 years old, this congregation. So been working on renewing their vision after 5 years into things, 6 years into things, developing some core values. And then just in January, after a lot of work last fall towards developing a strategic plan, the congregation made the definite decision of following the path of exploring partnerships. And that's not about amalgamation. It's trying to think about what's a sustainable path for us. And it's a congregation that really is very committed to outreach and working in the community and don't really want to be tied to responsibility for maintaining a traditional church building. They don't have one right now. So
Right.
It's trying to figure out a partnership that is helpful for us for sustainability, but also helps them live out their mission and their vision into the future. So that was my interest in being part of this today because it's quite timely for us.
Great, and thank you. That's you're really living in the neighborhood. You're rooted in a neighborhood without a building, right? How is that different? I love it. Yeah, great. I see that Lindsay's joined us, but Carolyn and Sandy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I can go ahead. Sandy Hall, I'm with Crescent Fort Rouge United Church in Winnipeg, and we have gone down the path of sort of three missional areas. One is increasing our outreach to children, youth, and families in the neighborhood. The second is increasing our outreach to seniors. And the third is increasing our area of hospitality to the arts. So all of these are building on things that we've done for years. For example, we have a daycare in our building, but it's reaching out in new and expanded ways. And so, as with many other churches, our volunteer capacity, as well as funding pressures, etc., is pretty much the same as everyone else's. So we feel external partnerships are really necessary to live out this vision.
Awesome, and you have an interesting story of how that even started for you. So I can't wait to hear more. Thanks, Sandy. Nice to actually meet you.
You too.
Yeah. And Carolyn, I'm not quite sure if you wanted to just open up the space for everyone else on the line.
Hi, sure, I can. It's Anne, and I'm not sure if the Carolyn that's logged in is quote unquote my Carolyn, but if so,
yes.
Waving from my home. So I'm Anne Hoganson from St. Paul's United Church in Spryfield, which is a community within the bounds of Halifax, but kind of its own separate, very close-knit community. So we already have a separately incorporated outreach ministry and run a food bank and some community garden and some programs. But sort of on our congregational side, we are, as others have lifted up, really facing some financial pressures and kind of are at a crunch point where we need to envision something large that will help sustain our ministry in the area and also be a benefit to the community. So we have a fairly large land stamp. So we're looking at, we've had some conversations with a social enterprise group called Common Good Solutions. And of course we had met with Carla about a year ago, I guess now. And so we're looking to, I'm looking to get some ideas from some other folks and sort of get maybe a better sense on the breadth of non-church partnerships that are possibilities, and perhaps seed some new ideas in our own setting that we can take back to our congregation.
Great, goody, nice. Thanks, Anne. I appreciate that. And welcome, Robert. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. Or Lindsay, actually, you also joined us. Okay. Anyone else want to introduce themselves before we get rolling?
I'm not sure if I'm doing this properly. Can you hear me? It's Carolyn.
Oh, yes, Carolyn, perfect.
I just wanted to say that I am the Carolyn from Anne's church, and we're just looking at hoping to garner some ideas that we can take back to the church and add to our visioning. Great.
Well, thank you for joining us, and it's nice when you have your team here. That's pretty cool. Robert, Lindsay? Okay. So, I mean, jump in at any time if you'd like to. Otherwise, please keep yourself muted, and we're going to get rocking and rolling. I think what really has been happening is that there's a general trend towards partnerships, and we're hearing this with everyone who's on the line today of their experience with partnership and why it's so important. What's kind of interesting is that historically, we've started to get into a lot of rentals as churches, and so they started off often as partnerships. In fact, many nonprofit and outreach programs, they started off within a church. And what ended up happening is they started to grow, and they might have become their own entity, or all of a sudden they started to get more arm's length. And so although United Church has a very long history of solid partnerships with our outreach programs and some of our nonprofit partners, and historically, I don't know if you know this, but before a bill was passed by the government, they used to call the moderator of the United Church of Canada to make sure that we were okay with it. So relationships with all different areas of non-church, historically we have a long experience in this type of work. And yet what ends up happening is as society has become less religious, quote unquote, sometimes we felt that we couldn't and we didn't need to have the same relationships that we've had previously. And it's been really interesting because in the for-profit world, they started doing more collaborations. So we've seen railroads collaborate with each other. We've seen supply chains for cars. So Toyota working together. And then Toyota has actually helped Ford. I don't know if you know, like some of these really neat, where collaborations are actually a new strategic and a competitive advantage. And yet collaborations really started within a church context. And so it's really interesting this time that it's a time to re-own what that looks like. And what does it take is it usually takes social capital. And the interesting thing is that social capital in the neighborhoods and in the communities that we already are in, we know social capital takes 15, that's 15 years to build. And so for someone else to come into our neighborhood and to start to try and build partnerships and relationships, for them to get at the place where we already are rooted and where we are would take them 15 years. So we actually have this huge advantage, this huge secret that we don't even know about of our social capital in place. It's just we haven't necessarily reached out. With the Edge hat on, we've actually run over 70 community roundtables where we've invited people into churches, into the United Churches, and said, how can we partner together? And we've seen a minimum of one partnership that happens, and actually I could send out what that looks like if anybody's interested in doing that. And the number one reason why churches don't do partnerships that we've seen so far is they think that other people don't want to work with them. It's almost like our own mindset makes us think that people are not going to work with us. But as soon as they actually walk into our doors, meet the people who we don't have an ulterior motive. We want to make the neighborhoods a better place to be. We want to be in relationships with people. And we start with a place like that and put our hand out. What we're really genuinely seeing and that people wanted to work with us. They just didn't think that we wanted to work with them. So I think part of this conversation today is it a mindset change? Like what is it that's blocking us? But I wanted to start with some inspirational pieces here and really just throw it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about some of the partnerships that with his mindset, and yeah, you're right, I did say that, you are this rock star in Wellington. And with this mindset of going to speak to people and assuming that they want to work with you, assuming the good at the beginning, like how has that worked for you so far, Stephen? Can you talk about being a rock star?
Well, I'll have to get one of the other guitars out here. And Carla actually nailed the point, is quite often we have a predisposition to thinking that people will not want to work with us. I've done a lot of kind of work in looking at what that's about, and it has to do with institutional guilt and institutional feelings of not being enough in the community because of the because of sort of our depreciated nature of who we are in the community. And so if you take that and you just put it aside and you do a little bit of homework about first discovering what are your missional needs in the community. So if you start from the missional perspective, so here in Wellington, we look at housing and also at a significant shift in what our community is. We've moved from a farming community to a tourist-based community very quickly with the influx of a couple of major hotels, a number of wineries, a number of breweries. It's just that place to be right now. Even Family Day weekend, this last weekend, was very overcrowded. And so we're looking at a shift in our community, which has created a significant concern in the congregation of watching their community change. It's not what it was. And so one of the things that was in my way was the congregation itself. And I had to do a lot of work with the congregation to say, I know you're not invested in these things, but I am. So with your permission, just let me go out and have a few conversations. So I went out and said, here is a need. And I invited what we call our county government into a conversation around housing. I invited local social service agencies to get together. Because what we discovered was one of the things we had in common is many of those social service agencies, Lions, Elks, Legion, they're all feeling the same thing we are. We don't have the physical infrastructure to support the things that we believe are important right now. So we need to reach out with our uncommon partners, people we've not talked to in a very long time. Institutional government, boards of education, private industries, private individuals with money, developers, wineries, breweries. We had to reach out to the neighborhood. So a lot of this came for me from a rereading of Luke's piece on the neighbor, who is my neighbor, and then inviting the neighborhood into a conversation about how we are together going to address the fact that we don't have enough housing to support our infrastructure here.
Wow. Sorry, I need to stop you there because I think that there must already be tons of questions. Number one, I'd love to highlight that you looked for something that was in common. And I think that that's really cool because what you did is you realized that like being in common didn't necessarily have to be Sunday morning worship.
Nope.
Right?
Nothing to do with
being in common was like figuring out what was needed in the community. I love that you did that. Something very similar that we've done with the Social Innovation Challenge, working with universities and colleges. We realized that what was in common was that we both wanted to support young leadership. That's what university's goal is, right? And so for them to realize that a church might worry about that too, that was a way that we could partner. So I love that you highlighted a best practice already. But I have to say, you just said, I went out to the community and we decided to have a conversation with them. Like, is there a way to role play this? Because that seems like a pretty big leap. Like, so what does that look like? Was that in a coffee shop? Like, how does that work?
So part of that was forming some one-on-one relationships first. So we have an influx of tourism in here. One of the dilemmas is housing prices have escalated parallel to what's happened in Toronto. Airbnb is the new thing, which is common, I think, for probably many of the people on the phone now. So I went to the most recent hip hotel here and said, just listen to the wait staff. And we started to ask, where do you live? Do you live in the community? More and more the answers, in the last 2 years, the answers became, no, I can't. So then I went to the owners in Toronto and said, you have a problem. Your staff has nowhere to live here. They said, yeah, we do have that. I said, I have a problem. My senior community can't find a place to live anymore because we don't have rentals available. We now had a problem in common. I did that with them. I did it with the wineries. I did it with all the we have 11 restaurants in a town of 1,500 people.
Wow.
I did it with them. And what I did is started to show the thread. The one thing we have in common here is a lack of housing, affordable housing. It doesn't just affect the church worshipers. It affects the multi-million-dollar industries. It affects the ability for startup.
So I want to kind of lift up two things that I heard from you again here. Is number one, it was all about listening, which I think we're supposed to, as faithful church folk, we're supposed to be good listeners, right? I think so. And then the other part here that I heard is that you did things one-on-one.
Yeah.
What I really like about that is that it's an understanding that it does take time. And I think that the one-on-one, when you see someone else in the eyes, that means that it's a genuine relationship from the get-go. Like, that's kind of what I'm peeling back right now. Would you agree with that?
And you also have to hold on to the idea that who and what we are as lay people or as ministers, that the church is a legitimate entity in your neighborhood, that we are something in your neighborhood. And we often forget that. We think that people don't look at us, that we are only the few that gather on a Sunday morning. No, we are integral in our neighborhoods. And the proof for me was I attempted to take the church down, to remove it and sell off our $3 million piece of property and move on. The community said no. I said, okay, then how are we going to work in relationship together so that we can maintain the infrastructure of our building? So that's how we began to partner around that. We are actually have to reach out to who comes on a Sunday morning. We have to partner in order to stay relevant. They want us. We have to remember that.
So when you started to say things like, we are an organization in this community, what kind of feedback did you get? Like, what was the immediate response? And were you surprised by that?
Yes, actually. Because a lot of people say, well, what do you do? Remember, no one knows what goes on behind these doors on a Sunday morning. So we had to talk about beyond Sunday. We had to talk about our mission, our initiatives, our ministry. What do we see as important to us? So by marking in the community what we were most concerned about, that's not a Sunday morning conversation. That's not a Jesus God conversation. You have to hold that for a little bit. By simply engaging in conversations about what we share in common in this community, and then being able to speak to it from a learned position, through the lens of Jesus, through the lens of the church, but by inviting people into saying, okay, how can we partner together to work on this problem together? We share it.
No, I love that. And I love that you've been able to be so succinct on how to do that. And also the fact that the conversation about God and Jesus is still there, yep, but it doesn't have to be the lead.
No.
And that's very, now I do want to open it up because you've given lots of great examples of partnerships, but I know we have lots of people on the line who have built amazing partnerships as well. I gave the example of Social Innovation Challenge with universities. What I'd like to throw out there is that we've given examples about governments and some large organizations and institutions. Does anyone have an example of maybe how they partnered with a nonprofit or even a for-profit? I'd love to expand the scope of what a non-church partnership can look like.
I could talk about a couple. We're, and have been for decades, but we're really big on the arts in our church. And we have two partnerships currently going. One is with a not-for-profit music group called Home Roots, and that's headed by Mitch Podolak of Folk Festival fame everywhere. And so we're partnering with them. What that brings to me is access to expertise for expanding our concert presence, as well as we're beginning a folk music school in the church, which in essence, they're the engine that will drive this. And what do we have that they want? Well, we have space, we have some volunteers, we're starting an instrument bank, we have access to community, etc. So it's a mutual bringing together of resources. We also have been approached by two actor-director writers, and they have formed something in our church called the Keep Theater. So they are artists in residence. We just had a play run. They were part of the Maine Theater Center's festival. And we just had a play run, and we had like 80 people a night come in just for the play. That was over a 2-week period.
Congratulations. Wow.
Yeah. So they're bringing expertise. They're bringing that cherished 20, 30-something group into the church. They have access to volunteers that we don't have. They also have access to lines of funding that we're not able to access. Entities that give money to everybody except churches. And what they bring to us is not only the increased use of the space, but also a particular demographic that we don't typically attract, as well as they're bringing funds into the church that will actually renovate some of the space for their use, which benefits us. So, yeah.
Well, congratulations. And I just remember when you first got one of your new partners, you were saying to me, it was almost just because you started realizing that partnerships, like how important and impactful they can be, and you started talking to people differently. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Well, we did. I realized very quickly that in some of the potential areas that the space could be used for, or some of the mission areas that we wanted to go down in a more fulsome way, we don't have that expertise. It's not really our jurisdiction. However, we have a strong desire as a congregation to serve in that way. So it automatically started to ask people who do have the expertise. And Winnipeg, albeit, almost 700,000 people, we're really just a little village. So it doesn't take long to get to somebody like Mitch Podolak. Anyone know Mitch? Yeah, I do. Can you call him and ask if we could have a conversation? And he sees the church and the space and the acoustics and the history and the people, and he sees that potential also for them. So it just, again, it starts with those conversations and reaching out.
Yeah, and you didn't underestimate your social capital, right?
No.
Because every person you know knows at least 250 people, and that's even bigger with social media.
Right.
So good for you.
And the interesting thing is, people start talking about community. What community are you speaking of? In many respects, people say, well, we don't know the neighbors across the street. Mm-hmm. Well, there's other types of community. So I think you also have to expand your mind in that way to talk about the arts community, or the music community, or the daycare community, or the health community, or whatever it is. So, and what we're finding now is we actually are getting neighbors, physical neighbors sort of coming in and going, we need a neighborhood cleanup. Could you head that up here? So, and that's what we want. That's exactly what we want.
So it's interesting, and I really appreciate all the examples so far, because as embracing the spirit, when I talk to people, often they go, well, I don't know if we can start a new initiative because we don't have the manpower or people power, pardon me. Because of that, they don't want to move forward. But what I'm hearing is that when you do things outside of Sunday, is that you're bound to have partners who are non-church, volunteers who are non-church, and so you're expanding the size of the pie. It's not divvying it up differently, you're expanding it. And your example went beyond just not only the volunteer, but the fact that the financial impact that it makes. But it only makes that financial impact if it's not a focus, I think. Like as soon as you have an
So as the lead minister here in Wellington, having to wrestle with where my time goes is always tricky. Often congregations are not, and a lot of the other work I do is with other congregations to look at identity. Part of what we wrestle with is our identity. And so we're not as rich as we used to be. We're not as comfortable as we used to be. Many of us often are burdened by what we often call the albatross of the buildings that we are in. And yet what we're discovering now is those buildings are often become blessings as well, because other people are seeing the value of either the building or the space that you're in. And I love how Sandy opened the door to a deeper conversation today about it not being about Sunday morning. Often our congregations register the effectiveness of the work of their minister by how many people are in the pews on Sunday morning. 2 years ago, we had a conversation at a board meeting where people said, hey, we're in the black, but we don't understand why that is, because we don't see that many more people here on Sunday morning. Well, why we're in the black is because of the partners that we've engaged with who are actually now seeing the value of our ministries and our mission, see them as shared values, shared ministries, shared missions, and are contributing to it. So we'll make more money from opening the doors to a concert than we will on a Sunday morning. But that's a wrestle, because I know where the money's coming from. I know that it's coming from partnerships. Congregations often don't see that. And we have to then, at the same time, use our time to help our congregations understand the value and the blessing of what we have and what we can do with it. That's not easy work to do.
So just adding on to that then, like, it's kind of interesting is that you have renters, but you don't call them renters, you call them partners. How have you made that difference? And how do you continue to bridge that gap? So how do you manage renters versus partners, and what does that relationship look like?
By engaging in the work together. So for instance, this summer in celebration of World Water Week, we have members of the Canadian Opera Company, members of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra will be playing here for 5 days. Now we're blessed by the fact that we have been discovered. Wellington is discovered. And so people are coming here saying this place is beautiful. They've engaged in some Sunday morning conversations. We've engaged in conversations with them about, let's partner together. Not, would you like to rent our space, but let's partner together on something. So in celebration of World Water Week, we're partnering with these entities to focus on redeveloping our beach here because it's now being overrun with tourists. By using the word partner and by then not engaging in a rental agreement. Now, the congregation would love to engage in a rental agreement. I'm pushing back against that by saying, let's find a shared ministry together and partner, and then ask for a contribution towards the mission and ministries of the church. We know that that actually brings in more money. What it also does is it gets people in the building who then want to ask, well, what are you doing here? What is the church up to? What is important for you? And so simply by engaging in invitational conversations, much like what Sandy is doing, with clear guidelines about who and what we are, people get excited by that.
That's
so
wonderful.
Stephen, it's Peter.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable or uncomfortable about calling your church a community hub?
I'm very comfortable with that. I'm moving away from its identity as only a place of worship to using language like sacred space and using that word sacred within the community, that our community itself is sacred space. And we share this blessed space we call home.
Thank you. So I am proposing that it is the mindset, and I think it's that charity to social justice model is one thing that makes it hard, but everyone in this conversation, I mean, there's different challenges that we face of building partnerships. So I'd like to open it up of maybe us brainstorming together, as well as maybe helping each other in what is the challenge that you're facing in partnerships. And it'd be great if we could workshop that and get some examples of how people might have overcome some of those challenges. And you can see I did open up the chat. I see from Sean right now, one of my questions relates to partnerships without the resource of a building. For us, church is about the community, not a building. So is that one of your challenges, is not having a building? Thank you, Sean. And we are seeking to form a partnership without bringing a building as a resource. So any ideas of how we actually message this and maybe an approach that Sean could take? As you guys kind of noodle it around, I mean, definitely when we look at our asset mapping in general as faith communities, communities of faith, thinking outside of the building is a challenge, but also recognizing that as congregations, as community of faith, it's actually not the building that's our strongest thing, it is our people. And we've seen this definitely in any of refugee sponsorships. Typically, we'll see that 1/3 of refugee sponsorships are from non-church folk in the community. That's roughly what we've seen across the United Church of Canada over the last 2 years, is that 1/3 of givings and leadership is non-church. So that's amazing. But what we see is that the primary leaders are still the church leaders, because we've been trained to be amazing volunteers, amazing leaders, to stick things out. And so to make that and understand that that's one of our biggest assets, because I mean, United Church women, all of our volunteers, I mean, they're formidable to say the least. But I love to throw that out to everyone else. Is any advice or ideas for Sean to approach partnerships with us?
Sean, one of the possibilities is when we don't have a building, we still have it. And by identifying what the needs are within your community and then how other groups can respond to those needs, and those needs can be different than our usual church language. It's just by engaging people in conversations, by starting with those one-on-ones. What's happening in our community? What's important? What do we need to focus on? And the more one-on-ones you have, now you've just formed a community. And you can bring those people together to 2-on-2s, to 3-on-4s, just grow that network a little bit. Now all of a sudden you've got this network of concern.
I love that. The thing that we've seen, or I actually met someone who sounded kind of similar actually today, where they were called the Dell, or the Dale. And in Parkdale in downtown Toronto, there was a faith community that also doesn't have a building. And so what they realized that their space in Parkdale was not actually the building, because they didn't have one, but it was actually connecting the agencies together and forming that network, which is kind of similar to what Stephen just said, and that's actually their strategy. Yeah. So even looking that up in Parkdale in Toronto, it's a regentrifying part of Toronto, and a lot of people actually moved to that area because it was eclectic, but now it's becoming more affluent and kind of more just one type of person is moving in, and it's not the neighborhood that it used to be, and they're trying to hold on to who they are as an identity. So there was a role there. We've also seen a community in ministry taking a similar space in that Jane and Finch area. So I believe it's Barry who's up in Jane and Finch, and he found that his value as an entity there and as a leader of the community and ministry is the connection piece more than needing a building. Thank you, Peter. It looks like you're adding here community roundtable to repurpose the unused, underutilized space. So Peter's pointing out, even though you don't have a building, there's probably underutilized institutional or spiritual institutional space there. And he also agrees, starting with 4 community members, to think about the needs. Great. So we've talked about why it's hard. Now I'd like to flip this and talk about what are best practices that each of us are seeing and what's working for us. We've already heard about having something in common. We've already talked about, but we can dig into that further, of how to do that, because we've had lots of examples of what that could look like. And we've also talked about how it is about the one-on-one to then building into more, and the network approach and how key that is. Any other best practices that you're seeing in your own work that you'd like to share? And please feel free to use the chat too if you're more comfortable with I can start us off again. So for me, what I find is that the social capital taking 15 years to have, I always just think you may as well start now. And my big thing is I always look for a way, I call it, you have to crawl before you walk or run. So whenever I meet with someone, often we have to do a data dump of like, here's everything I'm up to, here's everything you're up to, where there's some ways to work together, but I never try and take too big of a bite at the very beginning. I always think like, is there a way that very easily with no risk for both sides, can we start to learn a little bit more about each other? And so it's a small win approach, but I find that every single time that happens, I can eventually achieve something in the relationship with them that would have been impossible at the first conversation. So always looking for those small wins to move things forward and have a better understanding of each other.
I think another element that I'd like to add is the partnerships with other churches that are in the same space. So Sandy, you talked about the art space. Well, there's one just north of Toronto where they run an art hub within their church space. And by connecting them with you and you with others, you know, you can build on the best practices of that same model.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a great idea. And I think it's a great idea even within our geographic area. Like I'm aware of a few other churches in Winnipeg doing a few other things. We should try to form some kind of a network of churches that are partnering with the arts and to support each other, to make sure we're not duplicating effort, to support, you know, see if we can even develop sort of specialized areas, if you will. So for example, I'm aware of one church that's running sort of group exploratory art making practices. Well, we're not doing that. And being aware that they are doing it, maybe that's kind of an area of specialty. Whereas we're hosting huge choirs and big concerts, etc., and they're not doing that. So that's kind of what I'm referring to regarding specialty areas. But I've sort of started picking up their posters and literature and Facebooking it for them, you know? And I think they're sort of like, oh, what's happening? You know, so another church is advertising our stuff. Well, yes, you know, because it's good stuff and we should be supporting you. I don't see enough of that going on. So that's you know, to your point of forming these networks, I think that's a really good idea. The other thing around partnerships, there's quite a bit of literature available in a general sense on how to form good partnerships. And from, you know, sort of studying some of that over the years, two things that strike me as being foundational to a long-lasting and fruitful partnership is investing time in the communication and also trust through some kind of transparency. And so I find that bringing that to the table immediately and also understanding that it can be a huge investment of time that again has the optics of not necessarily being productive, you know, so there's very practical people, of which I'm not necessarily one, who would ask, well, what are you doing? Well, we're having another conversation. It does not appear to be an action step towards something fruitful. And the other thing that I wanted to put on the table for everyone was slightly off the topic we're on now, but it was really interesting. I had a major fundraiser have a look in the city, very successful fundraiser, at a proposal I was about to put into one of the foundations here. And their first feedback was, make sure you understand you're not recruiting members. Very important, you know, and you know, it could be the elephant in the room, but some of the optics around engaging people who are not of a church mindset is that we're trying to bring them in. You know, we might be a cult. We'll get them and we'll get them in the pew and that, you know. And to be honest with you, there's fear out there that we want that. We want something of that nature to convert them, to capture them, you know. And sometimes with a new partnership, I have to actually state that because I can see they're fearful.
No, thank you for that, Sandy. That was great. And I agree. I call it the elephant in the room when I'm speaking with a non-church partner. I will say we need to talk about God now, so you understand what I mean and what I care about, and like the fact that I'm not trying to convert you. And we talk about it like that. And it's quite funny to me that all the non-church partners, they always lie to me. They lie. And they say, oh, I was about to ask you about that. They were not going to ask me about the elephant in the room because they're petrified of asking me about it. And so you're right. As the United Church, it is our job to bring up the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Carla, one of the ways,
and they're scared.
Yeah. One of the ways we can do that quite effectively is that I just did a TED talk on Saturday in the community about the lens. It's a series on passions. And by saying, I'm identifying the need, and how I have identified that need is through the lens with which I see it. And that lens is Jesus, God, whatever we're going to say, that lens is church. But then inviting them to say, wow, we see the same thing. Could you tell me about the lens that you're seeing through? How have you come to recognize this issue in the community? That levels the playing field. It simply is an invitation into, we see the same thing, but through different ways, but opens it to being respectful of both ways.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And it gets the elephant out of the room.
Yeah, it's a tight squeeze when it gets out.
Yeah.
Any other best practices that you have found have really worked for yourself? Or we're starting to get into the point where if you have any burning questions for this online conversation, I mean, we're all experts here. Like I said at the beginning, it is about the peer learning with each other. So if there's something that's burning and on your heart right now, please share it, be it a question or a comment, or we'd love to continue to talk about the best practices as well. So my question actually for everyone, what I don't understand, and my job actually is to find partnerships across nationally. My big challenge is like, what is holding back? What do you think is holding back some ministries from building partnerships? And what resources or support would it be possible for us to give? What's needed? You could chat too. You can, if you don't want to say it out loud, you can just send me a chat.
Carla, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How many people feel supported by their congregations to go out and have these crazy conversations?
Hey, good question. Like what Sandy said, it doesn't seem productive because it's just a conversation.
Exactly.
That's funny. So you're thinking it's more maybe of an education piece with the congregations of what relationship is.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments?
And I love, Carla, I love Sandy's comment on the chat and that was going to be my next follow-up question is, how many people feel like they just don't have the skill sets to do this? It's not something that, I mean, when I was teaching, it's not something that we teach often, is to do this.
Thank you. Sean, I know you had a comment there.
No, I was just going to say that I felt supported by my congregation because that's what they want to have happen right now. I was responding to that first question.
Great. So in many ways, not having space allows you to refocus on relationship. Maybe that's what we need to do, is forget about our spaces.
That's true, but it's also, I think, for my congregation, I mean, when they started back in 2011, they first rented space and tried worship on a different day in it with another church, but it was a different denomination. But it wasn't a true partnership. It was like they treated this congregation like they were, a tenant. And it was only use on a certain day of the week. And then they worshiped in a movie theater. But the challenge with that was that their offices and their meeting space of where they do programs the rest of the time wasn't in the immediate catchment area or community that they were trying to be in. And so that was the challenge. So one of the challenges they've learned is that there's an advantage of having visible physical space where your flag is planted, so to speak. And their challenge has been not having that in the community where they're at and trying to figure out how to have that in partnership with another organization. And most churches that we've talked to, or examples we see, even in the city of Moncton, have been churches that have taken their physical space and redeveloped it in partnership with other organizations, or formed partnerships like the example of one, I'm sorry, I can't remember names right now, the person in Winnipeg saying about, with the ARC community. But when you don't have that, it's a different kind of challenge when you're trying to be a spiritual community and be a presence in a particular physical community of a city or town, and not have that advantage of a piece of physical space. And yet they don't want to be sinking all their time and money into maintaining that. They're trying to do something new. Right. And there's not a lot of examples I'm finding. That's what we're trying to find. Where are some examples across the country of other communities of faith like our own that we might talk with?
We would be able to connect you with St. Andrews in Calgary. I know that they intentionally did sell their space for missional refocusing. So they might be interesting in how they've done that and how they continue to still worship and how they've allocated those funds and how they're doing it. And even how I think for them, their identity was actually really tough to go from space to no space. So I think even that transition and how they've structured it due to that change might be interesting for you. Also connecting you with Barry and Jane and Finch, and how they find that they're the most needed and the valuable part for them is making the connections. So if you want to email me directly, I'm Carla I can put it in the chat box as well. That might be helpful for you. So I did notice a few things. I mean, number one, Peter did start sharing emails. If you would like your email to be shared, please put it in the group chat. And when we send out the recording to everyone and the follow-up, I'll make sure that everyone's emails who want them to be shared. So if you put them in the Zoom chat, I'll make sure that they are sent out as well. And just going through some of the chat pieces here. First off, Sandy, it could be the perception that they don't have the expertise to do it. Yes, definitely. And I find that hopefully these conversations make us recognize that it's not as hard as we thought it would be, but it does seem daunting, I think, at the beginning. Emma, I think it's capacity perceived as well. They're working so hard for self-preservation, they don't feel that they can engage outside. We've definitely seen that with Embracing the Spirit projects, where often the leadership has been told that their time as ministers is not allowed to be allocated for the Embracing the Spirit project. And then it's quite interesting when partnerships form and they see some small wins, how they do the paradigm shift. But you're right, at the beginning, it doesn't seem like that's part of what our job's supposed to be, even though it's probably one of the most important parts of our job. Thank you, Sandy, about trust and how to be genuine with that and the ongoing conversations. Thank you, Stephen. And Lindsay, we have just established a church viability committee at our church. We're looking at ways to ensure future viability, building partnerships, and perhaps redefining who our church is. I feel like we have the support of some congregation members, though others are skeptical of what we might suggest. And that's fantastic, because I think what we've seen is that you do need a core group of leaders to start moving in the right direction. But it's almost impossible to get everyone on board at the beginning. You're always going to have that 2% naysayer. So I applaud you for moving forward, because sometimes they seem like the loudest people in the room. So.
And Lindsay, that's brilliant. Lindsay's picked up a point that often we don't think about, is that other groups have access to funds that we may not have access to. For instance, a housing project we're working on now in Wellington, by partnering with the county government, they're able to bring in funds that we could not access as a denominational body. And so, Lindsay, good on you. Just take that risk and invite those people in and see what they come with.
Thank you. So I just do want to highlight that it's 5 minutes after 2. We had kind of planned everything to be within an hour, but I know that Joshua did schedule this to be a little bit longer to give us a little bit more room for questions and comments, as well as for you guys to get connected with each other. So I definitely encourage you to put your email in the Zoom chat if you would like it to be shared with others. Because really the reason we're doing the online conversations is so that you can hear each other's stories, as well as be connected with each other afterwards. So if you think that Art Fest in Winnipeg is like the super coolest thing ever, because it is, yes, you should reach out to Sandy. Any other questions or comments as we start to wrap up? Stephen, as our big keynote on this, any final words that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think part of the dilemma becomes in spending the time to see where you are, who you are, and what you actually have as a resource. You'd be surprised at some of the resources you might possibly have around you. It's also the willingness to take some very big risks, but to partner with your congregations. Remember that your congregation is your first and foremost your partner in this, and to help them dream a little bit. Yes, we often get caught up in survival, just the Sunday to Sunday survival. But by walking around your community, and I'm going to say, remembering that not all of us have the luxury of, or the blessedness of geography or downtown viability or lake on a lake or tourism or whatever it's going to be. But we do have something that we can reach out to somebody else to say, we share this concern. How are we going to address this concern together? 9 out of 10 things you throw out there are going to fall by the wayside, but that one thing is going to take root. Just do some homework. How are other people going to benefit by the thing you're talking about? Yes, developing housing for tourism industry workers is not going to benefit anyone in my congregation, or is it? Because are they not going to going to identify that, oh yeah, we have needs for seniors, housing needs for seniors and others, regardless of whether you're a tourism industry worker or a senior with mobility issues, or someone who just wants to live in the community. We share this risk, or we share this dilemma. How are we together going to address it? All of a sudden, the church becomes an equal partner, rather than someone smaller than the industry and the community. I'm just crazy, so I just go with it. So.
No, you're a rock star. It's different.
Oh, it's different.
I mean, only by a small margin, but. Yeah. Any other, as we kind of sign off, any other last comments? And I also invite you, if there was something that you really are feeling that you're going to take away from this conversation, or maybe that you're reignited to do something in the next week or month because of this conversation, I also invite you to share. I see people potentially typing in there. We are not alone. Thank you.
No, we're not. I want to thank
There is so much abundance, I feel, at every conversations that I have. And I think for me, when I speak with people and offer partnership and put my hand out for partnership, I'm always amazed by the reactions. It's never negative. It's never what you might have originally thought it might be. It's always positive. It's always encouraging. And I've always been really shocked at, years later, what that relationship has flourished into. For me, from this conversation, I really appreciate the insight about making room for the leaders to do this and highlighting how important this work is. So I will be taking that back and seeing how we can continue to do that.
Thanks so much, Carla.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Stephen.
You're very, very welcome. Carla, you've really highlighted a point, is that we have to continue to, in a very safe way, talk about the shifting role of ministry. Is that there is a significant pastoral leadership quality, but a lot of that is about outreach. It's how do we continue to be the voice in the community, to be a voice that is often silenced and pushed to one side, often because of, and I love what Sandy said, they're just trying to evangelize us kind of out there. Well, yeah, we are actually. We're trying to help, we're trying to invite you to see the world in this way, while at the same time acknowledging the value of the way you see the world.